My name is Rachel, and I've always known there was something about my presence that made others uncomfortable. I grew up in the same house as my cousins, ate at the same table, listened to the same stories from Grandpa, but there was always that sideways glance, that extra chair, that whispered doubt when I walked into a room. Even carrying the family name, it always felt heavier on my chest than it did on theirs. To continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please like and subscribe to the channel, write your name and the city you're watching from, so I can include a special greeting for you in a future story. The day my mother died, my aunt was the one who said, "She can stay, for now." That phrase never left my head. Not when I came back from base after 4 years. Not when I was notified about the will reading, scheduled for the Sunday after the funeral. I remember sitting in my small apartment off base, staring at the formal invitation. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind of paper that screamed old money and established families. My hands shook slightly as I read the date and time. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where I kept important documents. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Grandpa before I left for military service. He'd pulled me aside, his weathered hands holding mine. "Rachel," he'd said, his voice softer than usual. "There are things about this family that you don't understand yet, but you will." I thought about how he'd always treated me differently than the others. Not worse, just different. Like he saw something in me that they couldn't see, or maybe something in them that I couldn't see. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and forced tears. I stood at the back, watching my cousins play their parts perfectly. They knew exactly where to stand, what to say, how to hold their faces. I felt like an actor who'd never been given the script. After the service, my cousin Marcus, the oldest of us, approached me. "You know you don't have to come to the reading, right? It's really just for family." I looked at him, really looked at him. His eyes were cold, calculating. "I am family, Marcus." He shrugged. "If you say so." Sunday came too quickly. I chose my clothes carefully. A simple black dress, nothing flashy. I didn't want to give them any reason to look at me sideways. Well, any additional reason. The law office was downtown, in one of those buildings that looked like it had been standing since the city was founded. The elevator was old, the kind with the brass buttons that clicked when you pressed them. I was alone in there, watching the numbers climb slowly. When the doors opened, I could already hear their voices. My stomach tightened. I'd been preparing for this moment for days, but suddenly I felt like that little girl again, the one who was always asking permission to exist. "She's here," someone whispered as I walked into the waiting room. They were all there: Marcus, his sister Elena, their parents Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda, my other cousins, David and Sarah, even Great-Aunt Margaret, who I hadn't seen in years. They sat in a neat little cluster, like a fortress I wasn't invited to join. I found a chair slightly apart from them and sat down. My hands were folded in my lap, and I could feel the outline of the envelope in my purse. The letter Grandpa had given me that last night. "When the moment comes, you'll know," he'd said. I'd asked him what moment, but he'd just smiled and patted my hand. "Rach," Aunt Linda's voice was polite but cold. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. Thank you." "Good. That's good." She glanced at her husband, then back at me. "We weren't sure you'd come." "Why wouldn't I come?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Nobody answered it, but I could feel the weight of their stares. I knew what they were thinking, the same thing they'd always thought. Marcus cleared his throat. "We've been talking, and we think it might be easier if we handle the estate matters. You know, since you're busy with your military career and all." "I'm not too busy for family." "Marcus." "Right, of course," but his tone suggested otherwise. The lawyer's secretary appeared at the door. "Mr. Patterson will see you now." We filed into the conference room like mourners at a funeral, which, I supposed, we were. The conference room was everything I'd expected: dark wood paneling, leather chairs, shelves lined with legal books that looked like they'd never been opened. Patterson, Grandpa's lawyer, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who looked like he'd been practicing law since the Constitution was written. "Please, take a seat," he said, gesturing to the chairs around the large table. I watched as my family arranged themselves, Uncle Robert at the head, naturally, Aunt Linda beside him, Marcus and Elena flanking them like bodyguards. The others filled in the spaces, leaving me to choose between the far end of the table or a chair against the wall. I chose the chair against the wall. I'd learned long ago that it was better to watch than to pretend I belonged where I clearly wasn't wanted. Mr. Patterson shuffled through his papers. First, let me express my condolences to all of you. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, and I had the privilege of knowing him for over 30 years. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I stayed quiet. Now, before we begin with the formal reading, I want to make something clear. Mr. Patterson left very specific instructions about how this proceeding should be conducted. He requested that Miss Rachel be allowed to speak last, after all other matters have been addressed. The silence was deafening. I felt every eye in the room turn to me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. Sup about what? Marcus asked, his voice sharp. He didn't specify. He simply said that when the time came, she would know what to say. I touched the envelope in my purse again. The paper was soft from age, worn from being folded and unfolded so many times. I'd read the letter dozens of times, but I still wasn't sure what it meant, or when I was supposed to use it. That's unusual, Uncle Robert said slowly. Your grandfather was an unusual man, Patterson replied with a slight smile. Shall we proceed? For the next hour, I listened as Grandpa's life was divided up like pieces of a puzzle. The house went to Uncle Robert, the business to Marcus, various investments and accounts were distributed among the cousins. I heard my name mentioned once, a small trust fund that would provide me with a modest monthly income. It was more than I'd expected, and less than I'd hoped, but it wasn't really about the money, it was about what it represented, my place in the family, my value to them. As the reading continued, I found myself thinking about all the Sunday dinners I'd attended, but never really been invited to, all the family photos where I stood slightly to the side, all the conversations that stopped when I entered a room. And that concludes the primary provisions of the will, Mr. Patterson said, looking directly at me. Miss Rachel, your grandfather left instructions that you be given the opportunity to address the family before we close. The room fell silent again. I could feel the weight of their expectations, their curiosity, their barely concealed hope that I would just stand up and leave quietly. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope. The envelope was yellowed with age, and Grandpa's handwriting on the front was shaky, but unmistakable. For Rachel, when the family gathers to remember me. I'd carried this letter with me everywhere for the past 2 years, through training exercises, deployment, lonely nights in base housing. It had been my constant companion, this mystery that Grandpa had left me with. What is that? Elena asked, her voice tight. A letter, I said simply, from Grandpa. When did he give you that? Uncle Robert's tone was accusatory, like I'd somehow stolen something that belonged to him. The night before I left for my last deployment, he said I'd know when to read it. I looked around the room at their faces, some curious, some suspicious, all uncomfortable. They didn't like surprises. They never had. Well, Marcus said impatiently, are you going to read it or not? My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. The paper inside was the same cream color as the funeral invitation, but this felt different, personal, sacred. I unfolded it carefully, and saw Grandpa's familiar scrawl filling the page. At the bottom, his signature was shaky but determined. I could almost see him sitting at his old desk, thinking about what to write, how to say what needed to be said. Dear Rachel, I began, my voice barely above a whisper, then I cleared my throat and started again, louder this time. Dear Rachel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're sitting in a room full of people who think they know the truth about our family. They don't. I paused, looking up at the faces around me. The color had drained from Uncle Robert's cheek. Aunt Linda was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Should you be reading that out loud? Great Aunt Margaret asked nervously. He wanted me to, I said. He was very specific about that. I continued reading. For years I've watched them treat you like an outsider, like you don't belong, like you're some kind of charity case that we've taken in out of the goodness of our hearts. I've stayed quiet, because I thought they would eventually see what I see. I was wrong. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the sound of someone's breath catching. The truth is, Rachel, you're not the outsider in this family, you're the only one who truly belongs here. The words hung in the air, like a bomb that hadn't quite exploded yet. I could see the confusion on their faces, the way they were looking at each other, trying to understand what Grandpa meant. I kept reading, my voice growing stronger with each word. Your grandmother and I had 3 children, Robert, Linda, and your mother, Catherine. But Catherine wasn't adopted, as they've let you believe all these years. She was our biological daughter, born 2 years after Linda. The room erupted. That's impossible, Uncle Robert said, standing up so quickly, his chair fell backward. Mom never had 3 children. She had 2. She had 3, I continued reading. But when Catherine was 16, she got pregnant. With you, Rachel. The family was scandalized. This was 1978, and unmarried teenage mothers were still considered a shame to be hidden away. Aunt Linda was shaking her head frantically. No, no, no. Catherine was adopted. She was troubled. She came to us when she was 15. She came to us, I read on, because your grandmother and I sent her away when she started showing. We told everyone she was a troubled foster child we'd taken in. We made our own daughter pretend to be someone else to protect the family reputation. I looked up at them, seeing the truth sink in slowly. The way the pieces were falling into place. The way everything they'd believed about themselves, about me, was crumbling. She lived with your grandmother's sister in Vermont until you were born. Then she came back, and we maintained the fiction that she was adopted, that you were the grandchild of a foster daughter, not a true blood relative. Marcus was pale. If that's true, then why didn't Mom and Dad ever say anything? Because they believed the lie. I continued. Your parents were young when Catherine came back. They accepted what they were told. Only your grandmother and I knew the truth. And Catherine, of course. I folded the letter carefully and looked at each of them. My mother spent her entire adult life pretending to be someone she wasn't, pretending her own daughter wasn't her parents' granddaughter, living as an outsider in her own family. This is ridiculous, Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. Even if it's true, it doesn't change anything, doesn't it? I asked quietly. You've spent your whole lives treating me like I don't belong here, like I'm some kind of imposter. But I'm not the imposter. I'm the only one who's exactly who she says she is. Uncle Robert sat back down heavily. Even if this is true, why would Dad keep this secret? Why wouldn't he just tell us? I looked back at the letter. Because he was ashamed, because he thought he was protecting the family, because he made a choice when he was young that he spent the rest of his life regretting. The room fell into a stunned silence. I could see them processing, trying to reconcile what they'd just heard with everything they'd believed about their family, about me, about themselves. There's more, I said softly, looking back at the letter. Rachel, Grandpa's words continued. I need you to know that every day I regretted the choice we made. Every Sunday dinner where I watched you sit at the edge of the table. Every Christmas where you opened fewer presents than the other. Every time I saw that look in your eyes, the one that said you were wondering what you'd done wrong. My voice cracked slightly. I'd perfected the art of not showing emotion, but this was breaking through my defenses. You didn't do anything wrong. We did. I let my pride and my fear of what people would think turn me into someone I didn't recognize. I let my own daughter live as a stranger in her own home. I let my granddaughter grow up believing she didn't belong. Great Aunt Margaret was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her cheeks. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. I always wondered. You looked so much like Catherine when she was little. The night before you left for the military. I continued reading. You asked me if I was proud of you. Do you remember that? I did remember. I'd been nervous about leaving, about whether I was making the right choice. I'd found him in his study, looking through old photo albums. I told you I was proud, but I didn't tell you why. I was proud because despite everything we put you through, you became exactly the kind of person I'd always hoped you'd be. Strong, independent, honorable. Everything that Catherine was. Everything that I should have been. I looked up at Marcus, who was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not contempt or dismissal, but something that might have been recognition. I'm leaving you this letter because I want you to know that you are not an outsider. You are not a charity case. You are not less than anyone else in this room. You are Catherine's daughter. And Catherine was my daughter. And that makes you mine too. The words hit me like a physical blow. In 32 years I'd never heard anyone claim me like that. Never heard anyone say that I was theirs. that I belonged somewhere. I'm also leaving you this letter because I want you to know that you have a choice. You can take this truth and use it like a weapon. You can make them pay for every slight, every dismissal, every time they made you feel small. Or you can use it to heal something that's been broken for too long. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. The choice is yours, I said, looking around at their faces. Grandpa was right. I could use this to hurt you, to make you feel as small as you've made me feel all these years. I stood up slowly, the letter still in my hands. They were all watching me, waiting to see what I would do with this nuclear bomb of truth that had just been dropped into their perfectly ordered world. Do you know what it's like, I said quietly, to spend your whole life apologizing for existing, to walk into every room wondering if you're welcome, to sit at every table feeling like you're taking up someone else's space? Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. Do you know what it's like to love people who barely tolerate you? To spend Christmas morning watching everyone else open presents while you get a gift card and a pat on the head? To hear your own cousin say, "You're not really one of us," and know that somewhere deep down you believed it too? Alina was crying now, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Rachel, we didn't know. You didn't want to know. It was easier to believe that I was different, that I was less than you. It made you feel special, being the real family while I was just, what? A stray that wandered in. I walked to the window and looked out at the city below. People hurrying along the sidewalks, each one carrying their own secrets, their own pain, their own stories of belonging and not belonging. When I was deployed, I said, not turning around, I used to think about this family. I'd be sitting in some forward operating base in the middle of nowhere, and I'd think about Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and birthday parties. I'd think about how much I wanted to be part of something, to belong somewhere. I turned back to face them, but I realize now that I was looking for belonging in the wrong place. I was looking for it from people who had convinced themselves that I didn't deserve it. Rachel, Uncle Robert said, his voice broken. If this is true, if Catherine really was our sister, then we failed her. We failed you. You did, I said simply. But that's not why I'm here. I walked back to my chair and sat down, the letter still in my hands. I'm here because Grandpa asked me to be, because he wanted me to make a choice about what kind of person I was going to be going forward. What kind of choice? Sarah asked. She was the youngest of my cousins, only 25, and she'd always been the kindest to me. Not warm, but not cruel either. The choice between revenge and forgiveness, between making you pay for what you've done and moving forward with the truth. I looked at each of them in turn. I could take this letter to a lawyer. I could contest the will. I could demand my rightful share of the estate. I could make sure everyone in town knows that the perfect Harrison family built their reputation on lies and secret. The fear in their eyes was palpable. They knew I could destroy them with this information. They knew I had every right to. But that's not who I want to be, I said. And it's not who Grandpa wanted me to be. I pulled out another piece of paper from the envelope, a smaller one, folded separately. There's something else, I said. A codicil to the will. Something Mr. Patterson hasn't read yet. Mr. Patterson looked surprised. I wasn't aware of any codicil. Grandpa gave it to me to present when I felt the time was right. I handed him the paper. He said you'd know what to do with it. The lawyer unfolded it, his eyes scanning the text. His eyebrows rose slightly. This is quite unusual. But it's properly witnessed and notarized. What does it say? Marcus asked, his voice tight. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. It says that if Rachel chooses to reveal the truth about her parentage to the family, then she is to receive an equal share of the estate as a legitimate grandchild. Additionally, she is to be given the first option to purchase the family home at fair market value. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the calculations running through their minds. The house alone was worth over $2 million. An equal share of the estate would be hundreds of thousands more. But, Mr. Patterson continued, the codicil also states that if she chooses not to claim these provisions, then the original will stands, and she asks only that the family acknowledge the truth about her heritage. I looked around the room at their faces, fear, confusion, hope, and something that might have been respect. I don't want the money, I said quietly. I don't want the house. I don't want to take anything away from you. Then what do you want? Uncle Robert asked. I thought about it for a long moment. What did I want? I'd spent so many years wanting their approval, their acceptance, their love. I'd wanted to be one of them so badly that I'd let them make me feel small and insignificant. I want you to know who I am, I said finally. I want you to know that I'm not some charity case you've been tolerating all these years. I'm Catherine's daughter. I'm Grandpa's granddaughter. I'm your niece, your cousin, your family. I stood up again, feeling lighter somehow. I want you to know that when I was 8 years old and you forgot to invite me to Elena's birthday party, it wasn't because I was forgettable. It was because you'd convinced yourselves I didn't matter. Elena flinched. Rachel, when I was 15 and you told me I couldn't wear mom's dress to the school dance because it was too nice for someone like me, it wasn't because I wasn't worthy of nice things. It was because you'd decided I wasn't really family. When I came back from my first deployment and you asked me if I was still playing soldier, it wasn't because my service didn't matter. It was because you'd never seen me as someone worth taking seriously. I walked toward the door, then turned back one more time. I want you to know that I forgive you. All of you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of the anger I've carried for so long. Chapter 9. The weight of words left unsaid. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. I'd said everything I needed to say, and somehow the silence felt peaceful rather than empty. I kept thinking about the look on their faces when I'd walked out of that conference room. Not relief, which I'd expected, but something heavier, shame, maybe, or regret. My phone rang 3 times on the way home. Elena, then Sarah, then Marcus. I let them all go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk yet. I needed time to process what had just happened, to figure out how I felt about finally knowing the truth. At home, I made a cup of tea, and sat on my small balcony, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in my life, I felt like I knew who I was. Not the charity case. Not the outsider. Not the girl who didn't quite belong. I was Catherine's daughter. I was exactly who I'd always been. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Can we talk, please? Then another from Elena. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And finally, one from Marcus. You're right. About everything. I'm sorry it took this long. I set the phone aside, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow I would deal with the aftermath. Tomorrow I would figure out what it meant to be part of a family that had spent 3 decades pretending I wasn't really one of them. But tonight, I just wanted to sit with the truth, to feel what it was like to finally know where I came from, who I was, why I'd always felt like I was looking at my life through a window instead of living it. The letter was still in my purse, along with the codicil I'd chosen not to claim. I pulled it out and read it one more time by the light of my phone. Rachel, the final paragraph read. I hope you'll forgive an old man for taking so long to find his courage. I hope you'll forgive us all for making you carry the weight of our shame. But mostly, I hope you'll remember that you are loved. You have always been loved. You just didn't know it. I folded the letter carefully, and put it back in the envelope. Tomorrow I would probably frame it. It was the first thing anyone in my family had ever given me that felt like it was truly mine. I thought about my mother, about how she'd lived her entire adult life as a stranger in her own family, how she'd died still carrying the secret of who she really was. I wished I could tell her that the truth had finally come out, that her daughter was finally free. The tears came then. For the first time all day, not tears of sadness, but of release, of finally understanding, of finally being able to breathe. 6 months later, I was cleaning out my desk when I found it, a letter I'd started writing the night after the will reading. When I was still processing everything that had happened, I'd never finished it, never sent it. But reading it now, I realized it said everything I'd been feeling but couldn't quite put into words. Dear family, it began, I've been thinking about what forgiveness means. Not the kind you give because someone deserves it, but the kind you give because you deserve peace. I sat down and read the rest of what I'd written that night, when the truth was still fresh and the wounds were still bleeding. I forgive you for making me believe I was different. I forgive you for the Christmas mornings when I watched from the sideline. I forgive you for the birthday parties I wasn't invited to, the family photos I was cropped out of, the conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. I forgive you for making me spend 32 years wondering what was wrong with me. I forgive you for the way you made me feel small and insignificant, and unworthy of love. But mostly, I forgive you for robbing me of the chance to know my mother as she really was, for making her live as a stranger in her own home, for making her carry the shame of your choices. I put the letter down and thought about the phone calls I'd been getting. Alina reached out every few weeks. Tentative attempts at connection. Sarah had sent me a Christmas card with a handwritten note. I know it's not enough, but I'm sorry, I want to do better. Uncle Robert had called once, his voice shaky and old. I keep thinking about your mother, he'd said. About how we failed her, how we failed you. I don't know how to make it right. You can't make it right, I'd told him, but you can do better going forward. Marcus had been different. He'd shown up at my apartment one evening, looking older than his 45 years. I kept thinking about what you said in the lawyer's office, he'd said, about how I told you that you weren't one of us. I've been thinking about that for months. And I realized that I was wrong. You were always one of us. You were just the only one who was honest about who you were. I'd made him coffee, and we'd sat on my balcony talking until late into the night, not about the past, but about the future, about what it might look like to be a family that actually acted like one. I want my kids to know their cousin, he'd said as he was leaving. The real story, not the lies we were told. I'd like that, I'd said, and I'd meant it. Now, reading this letter I'd never sent, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something you did once, it was something you chose over and over again. Every time the anger tried to creep back in, every time you remembered what it felt like to be on the outside looking in, I thought about Grandpa, about the choice he'd given me, revenge or healing, anger or peace. I'd chosen peace. But some days it was harder than others. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the original one from Grandpa. 2 letters I'd never send, but both part of the story of who I'd become. My phone buzzed with a text from Alina. Sunday dinner at Mom. Sarah's bringing the kids. We'd love to have you. I looked at the message for a long time, thinking about all the Sunday dinners I'd attended but never really been invited to, thinking about the difference between being tolerated and being welcomed. I'll be there, I typed back. Then I added, thank you for asking. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose to believe that people can change, that families can heal, that the truth, even when it comes late, can still set you free. I put my phone away and went to get ready for work. I had a life to live, a future to build, a family to learn how to be part of, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the right to take up space in my own story. The letter from Grandpa was still on my desk, next to the one I'd never sent. 2 pieces of paper that had changed everything. 2 choices that had led me here, to this moment, to this understanding of who I was and who I wanted to be. I was Rachel Harrison. I was Catherine's daughter. I was my grandfather's granddaughter. I was exactly who I'd always been. And that, finally, was enough.